Spider-Man 2 is obviously the sequel to the original Spider-Man, directed by Sam Raimi, and it stars Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, Alfred Molina, I hope I said that right, James Franco, J.K. Simmons, and this one is basically about Peter Parker is Spider-Man, because the first movie sort of addressed that whole origin story, and Peter Parker is basically in his prime as Spider-Man. He's solving crime as Spider-Man while also having to deal with a bunch of other things like school and his relationship with his friends, and it gets to the point where he doesn't really want to be Spider-Man anymore. He kind of just wants to quit. The villain of this movie is Doc Ock, played by Alfred Molina, and he basically has these artificial intelligence, like octopus arm things, and they sort of have a mind of their own because they're AI, and they kind of take control of his brain and make him go crazy, and yeah. So Spider-Man 2 is what many people regard as one of the best comic book movies ever made, and I agree. Spider-Man 2 is one of my favorite comic book movies of all time. Easily the best Spider-Man movie we've got so far because it really understands the character of Spider-Man. It really understands what he would be going through if he has to deal with college and being Spider-Man and his relationship with his friends and his jobs and everything that this poor guy has to do with. It really explores that to a deep level. This guy has two jobs at the beginning of the movie. He has to work with J. Jonah Jameson, and he also has to work with a pizza place. He gets fired from the pizza place. One of the things he has to deal with is slacking in school because of how busy he is. He's not getting to classes, he's not getting good grades, his teacher's calling him lazy. He has to be a good friend to Mary Jane at the same time because he wants to be with her, but he also wants to not be in a romance with her because he'd put her in danger because he's Spider-Man. He has to deal with that. He has to be there for Mary Jane when she needs him at her plays and all. He has to deal with his friend Harry, played by James Franco, who basically accuses him of being associated with Spider-Man and the killing of his father. He has to deal with Doc Ock, who's wreaking havoc all over the city, and he also has to deal with paying rent to his apartment. This movie beats Peter Parker down to the mud. You feel so bad for this guy in this movie. Everything is going downhill for him. Tobey Maguire is fantastic as Spider-Man and Parker in the first movie, but in this movie I think he did even better in this role because everything's going downhill for him. He's basically just losing everything. He's starting to go insane. He's getting emotional because of all these things he has to do with. I feel like Kirsten Dunst was also very good in this movie. The romance in this movie is still very good, but in this movie it really makes you feel sad because this entire movie, Peter Parker just really wants to be there for Mary Jane. He really wants to support her in her plays, but he never is able to get there because of his passion for saving people and helping the city out. Mary Jane is starting to dislike Peter Parker because he's never there for her. James Franco, I also thought he did a better performance in this movie because he really has to pull off a lot of anger, because in this movie Harry Osborn gets very angry at Peter Parker for supporting the man who killed his father, or supposedly, that's what he thinks, and there's a scene where he gets drunk and he yells at Peter Parker and he slaps him in the face. That's really heartbreaking stuff. Watching this movie again today, it was hard to watch, honestly. It's really emotional stuff. And also the villain Doc Ock, Alfred Maloney. Did I get that? Yeah, Maloney. This guy also did very good in this role. He went from making a cameo in Indiana Jones to doing a villain in a Spider-Man movie. I don't know why I brought that up, but I just felt the need to. I don't like him quite as much as Willem Dafoe as the Green Goblin, but I think he's very good in this movie. You really feel bad for him at several scenes because his wife ends up passing away, which was a very disturbing scene, by the way. Because Spider-Man 2, it actually wasn't afraid to go disturbing at points. There's a scene where Doc Ock is almost getting his arms cut off because these surgeons are trying to cut off the arms, and he ends up attacking everyone. That's really violent. It was more violent than anything we saw in the first movie, and when I was a little kid, my dad used to block my eyes from that scene because of how violent it was. There is some legitimately disturbing moments with Doc Ock, and I think that really helped for the better to make you really afraid of this villain. And speaking of actors that improved, J.K. Simmons is even funnier in this movie than he was in the first one. I don't know how they did it, but he was even funnier. Can you pay me in advance? You serious? Pay for what's standing there? The planetarium tomorrow night. There's the door. And also, Aunt May is even better in this movie. She has several heartbreaking scenes where she's grieving the death of Uncle Ben still for like a year. She's so good in this movie. I think Aunt May is fantastic. She's so good. So like I said, everything in this movie improves over the first movie. The action improves. There's the train sequence. Has anyone ever complained about that train sequence? I mean, I guess you can complain about Parker's poop face or whatever. One of the best action scenes from a comic book movie. Every time I watch this movie, I really look forward to seeing that train sequence because it's just so much fun. Spider-Man and Doc Ock battling on top of the train and him sliding on the pavement with his webs. It's the coolest thing. Especially that scene at the end of the train sequence where he's like inside of the train and his mask gets taken off and everyone's like, oh, he's just a kid. It's such good stuff. I absolutely love the train sequence. Not to mention the bank scene where what's his face? Doc Ock tries to rob the bank and then they're on this building and then he has Aunt May captured and she hits him on the side of the head. The action in this movie is so good. It's even better than in the first one. And speaking of that bank sequence, one thing that I always didn't really get about it was that Peter Parker just kind of runs away when Doc Ock comes, and then Aunt May's like, "Don't leave me now." But I think later in the movie it makes more sense because she's sort of like giving him this lecture about being Spider-Man and being a hero, and it's like as if she knows that he's Spider-Man. She's not really coming out and saying it, but I think she has an idea that he is Spider-Man. And in this movie you could have got the implication. I mean, in this movie you could have just got, oh, she knows he's Spider-Man by that scene where she's heavily implying it. But then Spider-Man 3 takes the whole dump on that whole thing, so I guess that wasn't the case, and the part where Parker runs away during the bank scene, it doesn't make any sense at all, because Spider-Man 3 totally ruined it. We'll get into Spider-Man 3 later. I'll have some things to say about that movie. And this movie is way more emotional than the first movie. There are several moments where I get choked up by this movie. For example, the scene where Parker, he's really getting to the breaking point. Like, everything's just, his world is just crushing around him. And he's really at the breaking point, and he has this vision where he's talking to Uncle Ben. That's some heartbreaking stuff. I was choked up watching that scene. The scene where Parker reveals to Aunt May that it was his fault that Uncle Ben died. That gives me chills to this day. Ever since I was little, that scene was just like, oh! I thought it was handled perfectly. I mean, it's such an emotional moment. The actress who plays Aunt May does it so perfectly. Her reaction to what happened, it's just such a good scene. And this movie, in my opinion, is also funnier than the first movie. There's the scene with the elevator. It's kind of itchy. Rides up a little bit in the crotch, too. It's stuff like that, it's just hilarious. And the scene where Parker eventually just decides not to be Spider-Man anymore and he's beating the geeky doofus Peter Parker again. He's just like walking around, he's like, raindrops keep falling on my head.
Raindrops are falling on my head. And just like the guy whose feet are too big for his bed, nothing seems to fit. Those raindrops are falling on my head, they keep falling.
And people complain that Tobey Maguire is too much of a doofus, but he's perfect. I love him. And this, especially in this sequence, he's just like walking around having the time of his life in the middle of New York City. And I absolutely love that sequence. The freeze frame at the end of that sequence, where he's just like looking at Dr. Connors, just like with his doofus face. It's hilarious stuff. Tobey Maguire is just so awesome. And throughout this entire movie, when Peter Parker isn't being Spider-Man and he loses his powers and he's wanting to stay Peter Parker, you're really just like, no, stop! We need you to be Spider-Man. We don't like this. You need to be Spider-Man, please! I feel like you can relate to Peter Parker's character so well with everything he's going through. The climax of the movie is also fantastic when Mary Jane finally figures out that Peter Parker is in fact Spider-Man. It's basically just like, finally. The climax fight scene is awesome. It's really great where he has to save Mary Jane for the billionth time. And yeah, I like it. Guys, Spider-Man 2 is, in my opinion, even better than the first one. It's brought to more emotional levels. It's brought to even funnier levels. The performances are improved. Basically like The Dark Knight to Batman Begins, or The Empire Strikes Back to the original Star Wars. It's one of those movies where just everything is improved upon. My flaws with this movie are basically just nitpicks. Like, there's the scene where he goes into the fire, just saving this random kid in a fire when he's Peter Parker and not Spider-Man. And that whole sequence literally had no impact on the entire movie. It was a very good sequence. I enjoyed it, but if it had more of an impact on the movie, it wouldn't be a nitpick for me. And also, another thing I didn't mention is that Mary Jane is getting married to J. Jonah Jameson's son in this movie. And this guy is not even a character. He has like 2 scenes, and there's nothing really good about this character. I mean, there is the scene where he's on that couch, and Mary Jane is kissing him, and little Nate really liked that scene. And all we really know about this guy is that he's an astronaut, and he's J. Jonah Jameson's son. That's literally all we know about this guy, and he's just kind of there to make Parker jealous, and there's nothing to him. But overall, Spider-Man 2 has very little flaws. It's one of the best comic book movies ever made, and I'm gonna give Spider-Man 2 an A. So guys, join me for Spider-Man 3 whenever the heck that happens. I have some stuff to say about that disappointing movie. And yeah, be sure to like this video, be sure to subscribe, and be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and yeah, bye-bye.